Now, one of the things that I always try to get across in any of the U.S. history classes I teach is the fact that you have to learn history, all right? And we have to learn all of it. We have to, as the saying goes, we have to look at U.S. history warts and all. We have to understand the good, the bad, and the ugly because we have made mistakes in the past. There have been times where we've gotten things wrong. And the good news is, whenever you make some kind of a mistake, you can learn from it. You can make sure that you don't make those mistakes again. But it does require that we look at what happened, that we actually understand what happened, and that we learn from it. History is fantastic because it allows you not just to learn from the mistakes you make. If you're a little kid and you touch something hot and it burns your finger, you learn quickly not to do that again. But history allows us to look back at the past and see mistakes that were made decades or centuries ago and learn how not to do that again. Now, this next section is one that actually deals with a lot of mistakes and a lot of difficulties from that time. We're going to be dealing with both segregation and discrimination. And there is a slight difference between the two. It might be a matter of cutting hairs, but we'll look at it a little more specifically as we move on. Now, this is going to eventually come to a head and start a resolution process in the 50s with the civil rights movement that we will be talking about later on. But for right now, we're going to look at what were some of the issues, some of the problems and whatnot that were actually going on in the United States at this time, in particular regarding both segregation and discrimination. We're going to start talking about the way African Americans fought legal discrimination. Now, there's a reason I have legal discrimination in the title here. For the most part, legal discrimination, you're going to think about the South, the southern states. They had in place at this time, late 1800s into the 1900s, up to about the 1950s, laws in place which were referred to as Jim Crow laws. Now, these laws made it illegal for African Americans to, eat in restaurants or to stay in certain hotels or things along those lines. So these laws were physically in place, passed by the state legislature and signed into actual law. Now, there's another word for that. It's called de jure, or by law. Now, this was predominantly in the North. In the South, rather, excuse me. In the North, you also would have African Americans facing discrimination, but in this case, it would be something called de facto discrimination or de facto segregation. It wasn't that there were laws on the books in the North, but de facto segregation really is talking more about what's in people's hearts. It's talking about the way people think about others based on skin color or different things along those lines. It is a lot easier to change a law than it is to change somebody's, heart and thinking. So while we will be looking at the ways during the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s that people were working very hard to change the way people thought, for the first part, we're really only looking at the legal fights. We're only looking at the ways in which the laws themselves are going to be challenged. We will talk some about trying to change people's hearts, but for the most part, we're just looking at the legal aspect. Now, this woman is named Ida B. Wells. Now, Ida Wells was a leader in the fight against discrimination in the late 1800s, early 1900s. She helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. She was a teacher and a journalist. She actually lost her parents to illness and ended up having to essentially raise some of her younger siblings. So this is a person that has had a lot of experience. And she was very cognizant. She was very observant and knowledgeable about what was going on around her. And she was looking at what was happening, in particular in the South at this point in time. Now, she was in general against discrimination, but in specifics, one thing she really crusaded against was racial violence. Now, you can think about all of this happening predominantly in the South, which is not an incorrect assumption, but don't think that that is the only place in which all this is happening. You had racial violence in all parts of the nation. Some of the worst in the early 1900s was up in Chicago, for example. So racial violence that Ida B. Wells saw, she wanted to use her gifts and abilities as a writer, as a journalist, to spread the word. She wanted to get the information out so people would see this. In particular, what she was working against was something called lynching. Now, lynching was when you would have a mob of white people going through and acting as both judge, jury, and executioner. Now, by that, I mean that someone would be accused of something. You'd have an African American accused of fill in the blank. A mob might form. They would literally grab the person. There would be no trial. There would be nothing like that. And they would literally hang the individual from a tree or a lamppost or whatever. So they would execute this individual. They were the judge, jury, and executioner. And she wrote in particular about this because this was a horrific action. You think about it. You could be walking along having done absolutely nothing whatsoever, be attacked by a mob of people, have a rope put around your neck, and then hanged until dead. And that was not uncommon. Now, it wasn't necessarily an everyday occurrence, but it was something that wasn't uncommon. And I believe even in your textbook, you'll be able to see some pictures where they have someone with a sign that mentions how many people were lynched, and things like that. So Ida Wells really wanted to work against the violence, against the racial violence. And again, is this something that she's going to be able to change everybody's mind, everybody's heart, and get everybody on the same page? No. But can you start chipping away at the foundations? Can you start digging away at what is propping up the racism that was causing this? Yes, you can. And that was one of the things upon which she was working. So you've got to understand, after the Civil War, we had in the South something called Reconstruction. Now, Reconstruction was the idea that there would be U.S. troops in the former Confederacy. They would ensure that all the rules were followed, that everybody who had the right to vote got to vote, and things like that. And that pretty much came to an end in 1877. One of the presidents you had recently, we mentioned Rutherford B. Hayes. Well, Rutherford B. Hayes wins the presidential election, but it's contested, and there's always been this argument that there was some kind of secret deal to end Reconstruction in order for him to become president. I don't necessarily think that's accurate. I think that by 1877, there was a wing of the Republican Party, Hayes was a Republican, that wanted to return the rule in the South back to the South. But the problem was, while Hayes and others thought that the individuals in the South would act like gentlemen, that they would act like, good people, unfortunately didn't come to pass. As soon as those folks were back in charge, things went downhill rather rapidly. So it was after Reconstruction, African Americans started to be kept from voting in the South. Now, like I said, before the end of Reconstruction, you had U.S. troops in the South making sure that everyone who had the right to vote was allowed to vote. And with that, there were a number of African Americans elected to Congress in different positions within the state governments. The drawback was that it only lasted as long as the troops were there. Those voting rights would be protected, okay? This was guaranteed. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are also known as the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed equal justice and equal protection under law. And then the 15th Amendment prohibited denying the right to vote based on race. And those laws were enforced throughout the South, but unfortunately only at the point of a gun. The only reason that the various Southern governments were actually going through and making sure all of this was on the up and up was the fact that you had troops there. And like I said, once the troops departed, once they were no longer there to ensure A, B, C, and D, everything started to fall apart. The last couple of places where things were still that way, the last two states that were pretty much abandoned, for lack of a better term, would have been Louisiana and South Carolina. And there are a number of reports of people being shot trying to vote and things along those lines. So the unfortunate aspect of all this is the fact that things had changed, but only with the threat of violence. And then once that threat was gone, everything essentially went right back to the way it had been before. There was not going to be slavery, but the African Americans in the South were not going to be treated as equal citizens. I mentioned a moment ago about the way that everyone was allowed to vote due to the 15th Amendment. Okay, up until that point in time, you had what was referred to as universal white male suffrage. What that meant was that if you were about 21 plus you were a white male, then yes, you had the uncontested right to vote. Well, following the Civil War, they did pass the 15th Amendment, which expanded that to you had to be 21, and as long as you were a guy, you could vote. Now, don't take this to mean that it was exactly that way across the country. Each state had basically its own rules for voting. You would go through and have states like Wyoming, for example, that would allow women the right to vote, decades before that was actually in the Constitution. But the 15th Amendment was supposed to make it illegal to go through and actually deny an African American the right to vote. But in the South, once the former Confederates were back in power, once the U.S. troops had been withdrawn after the end of Reconstruction, as I said before, things began to change rapidly. By 1900, all the southern states had set up voting restriction laws that had one purpose, and that one purpose was to prevent blacks from actually voting. You have to keep in mind, I mentioned this before when we talked about the Grangers, for example, there is power in numbers. And going out and voting is a huge source of power for any particular group. The newly instituted governments in the South, the former Confederates and what have you, they wanted to go through and make sure that the African Americans were not able to exercise that power. And so they went through and they set up a variety of different rules, regulations, and things like that, which had the sole purpose in mind of preventing blacks from voting. We would eventually get a lot of this actually taken care of. We'd have the Voting Rights Act in the 60s. We would actually outlaw certain aspects of what was going up here in the Constitution itself. But again, we're looking at 1900. If we weren't really going to get these things, the ball rolling until the 1960s, that's 6 decades, 60 years in which these people would not have the rights that were guaranteed to them by the Constitution of the United States. Now, some of the things that the southern states did, for example, was they required voters to be able to read. Okay, they called them literacy tests. Now, this isn't just along the lines that somebody hands you a piece of paper and you have to read what it says correctly. Okay, that would be far too simple. A literacy test, you had to be able to read it, obviously, but these were like word questions from a math class almost. It would be stuff that you would go through and have to answer about American history, or they would give you very convoluted questions that you would have to try and follow the logic to figure out what was actually going to happen. I mean, it was designed to make people fail. The literacy tests were required by everyone who wanted to vote, and usually it meant that they would have to make special exceptions for some people. For example, you would have 2 different literacy tests. If you were a black voter, you got the harder test. If you were a white voter, you got the more easy test. It could be questions like on the test for black voters, it might say something like, how many square footage was designed in the original U.S. Capitol building? And the white test might be spell cat. I don't know if those are actual examples. I know the first one is, but I don't know about the spell cat. But the concept is there, that the idea was to make sure that the black voter was not going to be allowed to vote, that they had failed the literacy test and therefore did not meet the minimum requirements that the state of fill in the blank actually required, in order to vote. Okay? I mean, it wasn't that they were denying the person the right to vote, they just didn't meet the minimum requirements. And that was the kind of logic that was being used. Another aspect of this, let's say that you did get the test, that you did answer the questions, correctly and whatnot. It was all subjective. The officials who were giving the test decided whether or not you got the question right or wrong. And what's more, they didn't even have to tell you which question you got right or wrong. They didn't have to tell you anything about it. You would have, say, a 30-question test. You had 10 minutes to complete it. If you missed one, I'm sorry, you failed. Better luck next year. And you didn't even know what you had done wrong. So it was all subjective. It wasn't like a test in school where there is a right answer or there's a correct choice. But instead, no, it was just, I don't think that's right. And the questions were often worded to make sure that it was as convoluted, as confusing as possible so that the person actually giving the test could decide for himself who got to vote and who did not get to vote. They passed people as they pleased. If they wanted to pass someone, they did. If they didn't, they did not. And there was no way to get around this. There was no recourse for you if you had failed the test. Another thing that was being used at this time, this is one of the terms you guys had, was a poll tax. Now, a poll tax is a tax that you had to pay just to vote. And it was technically required of everybody. Technically. The poll tax, however, was really again geared to try and make sure that African Americans couldn't vote. Keep in mind, a lot of African Americans in the South at this time were what were called sharecroppers. Sharecroppers were individuals who made very, very little money. You lived on the land that someone else owned. You had to provide the seed and everything. You had to do all the work. You grew the crop. And then at the end, you got maybe half the money. So a poll tax was a luxury. It was not something that people could easily pay. And so, as such, this was another way to keep African Americans from voting. Again, they're not denying anyone the right to vote. This is just, the requirement in order to. Okay? Now, the unexpected consequence of this was that it wasn't just African Americans that couldn't pay the poll tax. It was also poor whites could not pay the poll taxes. And as a result, they couldn't vote either. Now, in some cases, this was done deliberately. It was the idea that there were a number of the poorer whites that the powers that be did not want to vote as well. It was mostly geared toward denying the right to vote to African Americans, but, like we said, with anything political, you do have what's called unintended consequences, and that's exactly what happened here. You had poor whites also couldn't pay the tax, because you got to think, in the South, in this time frame, being poor meant being poor. It was very hard off down there because there was not a lot of work. There was not a lot of jobs. Most of the economic boom that had been going on since the Civil War had really bypassed the South. The South had not changed much since the Civil War. The only real difference at this point was that slavery was now illegal. Though I mentioned sharecropping, a lot of the African Americans were now sharecropping the land that they used to live on that had belonged to their masters when they were slaves. As a result, like I said, not much had really changed in the South at that point in time. So what do you do if you've gone through and you've set up everything to make sure that as few African Americans get to vote as possible, but the unexpected consequence is that you're also denying that right to certain portions of the community that are white but happen to be poor and can't pay the poll tax? So several southern states wanted to make sure that if you were white but you were poor, because there were white sharecroppers as well, and they were just as hard off as the African American sharecroppers were, whites who couldn't read or pay a poll tax could still vote. They wanted to make sure that there was a way around the law. Now, the problem is, how do you do that? How do you write a law on the books so that it applies to one portion of your society but not another? There's a quandary for you. There's a conundrum. So what do? They invent something called a grandfather clause. They added a grandfather clause to the constitutions of their states. Now keep in mind, every single state in the Union has its own constitution. We have the Constitution of the United States, but here in California, we also have the Constitution of the state of California. Every state has its own constitution, and each state has the right to adjust their constitution as they see fit. We as a nation could change our national constitution if we want to, but it's a long, drawn-out process. It's a lot easier for states to change their constitutions. And this is what happened in the South. A number of them said that they were going to add a grandfather clause, in particular to the poll tax. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States says that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, what that means is that if you had been a former slave, then you could not be denied the right to vote. You also could not be denied the right to vote based on the fact, the color of your skin. This was ratified February 3rd, 1870. So it had gone through the process of being, put forward. The states had approved it, and, we were off and running from there. And so even though you do have these southern states with the various poll taxes and things like that in place, this grandfather clause is going to come into effect. And this is essentially what it said. Anyone could vote. Didn't matter anything about your background or anything. You could vote if, no questions asked, if your father or grandfather was qualified to vote on or before January 1st, 1867. Now, you might ask why January 1st, 1867? Well, part of it had to do with the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, didn't get approved until December of 1865, but the one I just read from Amendment 15, that wasn't ratified until 1870. So basically it's saying if your father or grandfather was allowed to vote in 1867, then you didn't have to prove anything. Now, obviously, at that time frame, there were few, if any, African Americans that did have the right to vote on or before January 1st, 1867. But there were probably a lot of people who could say, well, my grandfather qualified to vote at that point in time. Therefore, this was a way to get around the law. It was a way to allow white voters who couldn't afford the poll tax, for example, to go through and actually, vote. The date was important because it was before the former slaves could actually vote. They went through and they were very meticulous. They were very careful about making sure that they had all this figured out. They wanted to make sure that everything was just right so that they would be able to deny the vote to the people they didn't want to be able to vote. The unintended consequence from before, that had been taken care of. They figured that out. And the drawback is a lot of this stuff would actually still be in place as late as the 1960s. And it would take another constitutional amendment to get rid of the poll tax, for example. Now, with all of these in place, with all of these rules, all these regulations, all of these different aspects of life there to guarantee that African Americans couldn't vote, some people decided to take up the challenge. And they challenged both the literacy tests and the poll tax, but the Supreme Court didn't allow it to stand. They made it to the Supreme Court. They went all the way through all of the steps that they were supposed to take. They did all of the things they were supposed to do. And when it got to the Supreme Court ruled that it was fine. Yeah, essentially just leave it alone, not a big deal. It's okay, that's legal. But this wasn't the only time people would take things to the court. This would be an ongoing process, and it would be a fight that would continue right up through the 1950s and 60s, and even to this day, some argue. But at this point in time, that particular battle was lost, but not the war. So though the Supreme Court did allow the poll tax and the literacy tests to stand, it did not stop people from trying to change things. Now, eventually, like I said, by the 1950s into the 60s, we're going to see a huge change in this nation. But the drawback is it was going to take time. It was not going to be something that was instant. There was the hope that you'd get to the Supreme Court, they would rule in favor, and everybody would go home happy and everything would be fine. But the drawback is it didn't work out quite that way. It was going to take longer than anticipated. So now you have all these different laws in place in regards to voting. Now you're going to make sure that different groups know their, quote, proper place, unquote. Separating people based on race became known as segregation. And we're talking about racial segregation here, which was law. I told you about the Jim Crow laws. This is what's going to be just the way things were in the South for a considerable amount of time. Now, racial segregation developed in schools, hospitals, transportation systems, you name it. There were schools for African Americans. They were referred to as, quote, colored, unquote, schools. There were two different types. There were white and colored schools. There were separate drinking fountains for whites and coloreds. Every aspect of life could be segregated through these laws. And like I said, these were predominantly in the South. In the North, it was more discrimination through, people's hearts and actions rather than actual law. But in the Southern states, this was going to be very, very common. These were those Jim Crow laws that I mentioned before. They separated whites and blacks in public and private places. It wasn't just schools. It wasn't just hospitals. We think of hospitals, as public. But it was also, let's say you owned a hotel. That is a private business. Well, the Jim Crow laws meant that you couldn't rent rooms to certain people. So Jim Crow was going to be the rule of the day. You had what was known as the Jim Crow balcony. If you went to the movies, you had to sit in the balcony. If you wanted to get something to eat, you had to go through and get it out from a window in the back of the restaurant. You weren't allowed to go in and sit down to eat. All these different things were going on. So they had gone through and they had denied African Americans the right to vote. Now they're going to go through and really make sure that they, quote unquote, know their place, as I said. So they're going through and they have these laws basically set up for every aspect of life throughout the South. Now, eventually, this is going to make it back to the Supreme Court again. Okay? Like I said, you're going to have a continuous attack on these policies and programs and things like that, but it's not going to be something that is just very simple to fix. So eventually you're going to have a case. One case in particular reached the Supreme Court. And that case is called Plessy versus Ferguson. And it dealt with a guy who wanted to buy a train ticket within the state of Louisiana, who was known at the time as an octoroon, is what they called it, which meant that his background, his family background, was 7/8 white and 1/8 black. And as such, they would not allow him to sit with the white passengers. He had to sit in a different, area. Well, they sued, saying that was unfair, that was unconstitutional. Now, the thing is, since this train only ran within the state of Louisiana, it never crossed a state line. That meant that Congress technically would have been prohibited since it was not interstate commerce. But it makes it all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, my favorite aspect of government to study is the Supreme Court of the United States. I love aspects about the judiciary and the court in general. But sometimes the Supreme Court is the most brilliant aspect of government ever designed, and other times they make some of the most pin-headed decisions that have ever occurred. Plessy versus Ferguson was one of those pin-headed decisions. This was not a good law, ladies and gentlemen. The court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that segregation was constitutional. It was perfectly fine, according to the court at the time, to go ahead and divide people based on race, that you could have separate accommodations, separate everything for people. Their argument was separate but equal. It created this separate but equal doctrine. Now, a lot of these Jim Crow laws and a lot of these southern states were very, very good at the separate part, but really stunk at the equal part. We'll take schools, for example. If you went to one of the quote-unquote colored schools instead of the white school, you got all the cast-offs. You got everything that the white schools no longer wanted. You got old textbooks, rickety desks, really poor equipment, whereas the white schools got all the new stuff. So yes, both sets of children did have a school to go to, but it would be a very difficult thing to say that they were actually equal. And the drawback was that this would now go on for a considerable amount of time. Once the Supreme Court had this doctrine in place, it was going to stay there for about the next 56 years. Plessy versus Ferguson was 1898. We wouldn't get a ruling in regards to segregation. It's called the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka ruling. We wouldn't get that ruling until 1954. It was going to take a considerable amount of time, almost 60 years, to overturn this decision. Not from a lack of effort, not from a lack of trying, just from a lack of the court being willing to support that. So we're going to have to deal with Plessy for a while. It's going to have a lot of long-term effects on American history. Did we finally get rid of it? Yes. Did we learn from our mistakes? Yes. But at the same time, even when you do learn from your mistakes, you still have to deal with the consequences of that mistake. And in this case, the Plessy decision was going to be a major consequence that the United States would have to continue to deal with.